Victor, here we are, you and I at UCLA. You've finished your doctorate almost 50 years ago, about the time I came here to do my doctorate, some 43 years ago. Yours was in physics, mine was in brain research. But each of us in our own way have had a passionate interest in the existence of God. How do you see the ways that we should begin to approach the subject?
Well, first of all, as a scientist, I have to look at the evidence. I have to say the only way that we really know, the only really serious way that we've been able to discover throughout human history of getting at knowledge, getting at information about reality is by observation, by the observations of our own two eyes, and also by the observations we make with our scientific instruments. And so if God is not visible to us, obviously if he showed up in front of us and we saw him there, we would easily believe in him. If we were convinced it was an hallucination, that is. But there are many scenarios you can imagine where you could be convinced. But not having that, you have to ask, what's the evidence of his existence, and that would have to be based on what effects he has on observations. And if God is the central figure of all existence that many believers think he is, then you would imagine that you could find observational evidence for his existence.
Is it natural to subject something that by definition is immaterial to the techniques and methodology of science, which is focused on the material world?
Yeah, I think so, because basically what you're doing is you're still looking at material things. You're looking at the stuff that you detect with your senses. It's you're still using, in other words, what's called methodological naturalism, and without assuming an ontological naturalism, without assuming that the reality behind it is necessarily materialistic in nature. And you can imagine many situations where a observation would be made. I can think of all kinds of scenarios where an observation might be made, a measurement made of some galactic energy source, and so that didn't agree with established knowledge. And furthermore, you showed that it couldn't agree. It couldn't agree with established knowledge. Then you'd have to look for other explanations. There are any number of examples like that. Perhaps a better example would be a revelation. It's commonly thought among all the world's religions that God speaks to humans, reveals certain truths to them. Well, if that's true, then those truths should be testable. If someone has some religious experience where they believe they've talked to God, and God has told them something that's going to happen in the future. Suppose, for example, that 100 years ago, God spoke to someone and said that there was going to be this disaster where planes would crash into the World Trade Center. Then you couldn't possibly find a natural explanation for that. And I think that's the secret to the gods of the gaps argument. Whenever theists
Which is what? What is a God of the gap argument?
The God of the gaps argument is the argument that science doesn't know everything, and here is this particular gap in scientific knowledge, so therefore we could fit God in there. Now, maybe God is the explanation, but until you rule out all possible natural explanations, then you can't make that assertion. The first thing you do is you try to find plausible explanations for what you see. So the first step that science would make in any observation of an extraordinary phenomenon would be to try to explain it in terms of existing knowledge, try to explain it naturally.
And if we look at the history of gaps in knowledge that God has been placed in by people who would choose to try to affirm his existence, those gaps over time have gotten plugged by science, and there are consistently fewer of them.
Right. It's similar to the argument that people make that, and the most common argument that you hear for the existence of God is that you can't see how all of this could have happened naturally. You point to the world around you. How could all of this? I can't see how all of this could have come about naturally. So therefore, it must be supernatural. That's a God of the gaps argument, and it's kind of an argument from ignorance. Namely, just because I don't understand how to explain some phenomenon naturally, that doesn't mean that science might someday not be able to explain it. But on the other hand, this is the argument I run into. People will say, well, science will always, we never can know whether science will find some explanation. And I dispute that. I can think of all kinds of examples where science might have failed to give you an explanation. One example would be evolution. Evolution might not have worked. You can think of all kinds of ways to falsify evolution. One way would be that the universe had turned out, the Earth had turned out not to be old enough for evolution. This was once a good argument. At the time that Darwin came up with his theory, the estimate of the age of the Earth was far too short, and because people didn't know about nuclear energy. And so when the discovery was made of nuclear energy, then finally the sun was, we had a source of energy for the sun to last long enough for evolution to develop. But it might have turned out otherwise. So right down the list, you can find examples of where gaps in scientific knowledge have existed, and at the time were plausible sources of God's intervention. And then time and time again, they've been closed by people like Darwin.
So even though there may be some gaps today in cosmology or other areas, that you would have confidence that over time these will be closed just as the ones in the past have been.
Sure, and all the scientist really has to do is make a plausible explanation. This is, again, a criticism I run into when I give these arguments. People will say, well, you can't prove this. Well, maybe you can't prove it, but if you have a plausible explanation that still agrees with all existing knowledge, then that's sufficient to defeat the God of the gaps argument, because you have to be able to demonstrate that no possible natural explanation is even plausible.
Let me give you this argument that says that, of course, the natural world should work naturally. And if you are trying to argue that God's existence can only be proven or affirmed or demonstrated by showing some irregularities in the natural world, well, that's not the type of God that I worship. This is the argument, because I worship a God who's smart enough to make it all work together so he doesn't have to intervene and tinker with it all the time. So you're trying to say that you're trying to say that God doesn't exist because there is that the world works perfectly in its own internally consistent scientific way. Well, that's the God that I worship, someone who is smart enough to do that, rather than some false God who has to who started off one way and then had to keep intervening.
Well, there are implications of that. I mean, I agree. That's a God that I couldn't disprove. I couldn't make a strong argument against, other than the argument that there's still no evidence for that guy. I still think, I still think that absence of evidence is a good argument against the existence of God. It may not be proof that God doesn't exist, but it's still evidence of absence. But you can imagine the situation, for example. Again, let me talk about evolution. If we take evolution literally, we just believe the fully natural and materialistic theory of evolution, it implies that humanity is an accident. So you would have to say the God that you're worshiping is a God that did not create a universe in which humans are special. he created a universe in which humanity is just an accident. And if it could have happened any number of different ways. Stephen Jay Gould used to talk about rewinding the tape of evolution and saying, even if you didn't change a single physical law, chemical law, biological law, you still would have a totally different, because there's so much accident that goes on in the processes of evolution, you still would have a different set of species today, and including humanity. Humans wouldn't exist.
If I would choose to believe in God and try to infer what this God is like from the physical world, I would take one of the words I would begin with is probabilistics, because the physical world embeds this everywhere you look, from quantum mechanics to evolution, to all aspects are built on probabilistics. So if there is a God, that God works probabilistically. Now, I'm not sure what follows from that, but it to me textures the idea that humans would be an accident within that process, because if you have so many different possibilities and 100 billion galaxies and hundreds of billions of stars in each galaxy, and all of those kinds of things, probabilistically things would happen.
Right. Well, you'd be believing in a God that Einstein said he didn't believe in. Namely, he didn't believe that God plays dice. You'd be saying God does play dice. I have a nice slide of that. It shows God throwing the dice, and that would be possible. And you could imagine there are theologians who have, such as Kenneth Miller. Well, he's actually a biologist who's a Catholic and a believer, and he has come up with the idea that God could have worked by any of the possible pathways.
A probabilistic God is a God you could believe in. I'll convert you.
Except I have to have evidence. I still have to have evidence that there's such a God, as long as I still could explain everything naturalistically, materialistically, then what reason would I have to introduce such a hypothesis, you see? So, but yes, that would be the type of God that would be possible, but we don't believe in Bigfoot just because Bigfoot's possible. We don't believe in him because there's no evidence for him. The Loch Ness Monster and so on. So why is God any different?